It didn't begin with an announcement. There was no sudden press conference, no moment where everything changed in front of cameras. Instead, it started quietly, almost unnoticed, a subtle shift in focus that only became visible when people started paying closer attention, because in cases like this, the biggest turns rarely arrive with noise. They emerge in silence, in the way attention moves from one place to another, in the way questions begin to center around someone who was always there, but never fully examined. And that's exactly what is happening now in the Nancy Guthrie case. A shift that feels small on the surface but carries weight the moment you begin to follow it. Because attention is not random, especially not in an investigation. It moves with purpose, guided by patterns, by behavior, not by details that don't quite align until they suddenly do. And now, that attention appears to be moving towards someone whose role in this story has always been present but never fully defined. The son-in-law, and the question isn't just why, it's why now. Because timing is everything. And when focus changes at this stage of a case, it suggests that something has shifted beneath the surface, something that may not be immediately visible, but is strong enough to redirect the direction of the investigation. And that's what makes this moment so important, because it signals movement. It suggests that the case is not standing still, that it is evolving, adjusting, responding to something new, something that has caused investigators to look again, to reconsider. So to place someone within the sequence of events in a way that demands closer examination. And before we go deeper into what this could mean and how this shift may reshape everything we thought we understood, I want to take a moment to welcome you to the channel. We look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we begin this journey together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. And now as we return to this shift, the focus sharpens. Because when someone becomes part of the conversation in a new way, everything connected to them begins to come into view. Every interaction, every moment, every detail that once felt ordinary is re-examined under a different lens. And that lens is what reveals patterns, not by creating them, but by allowing them to be seen more clearly. And that's where this begins to take shape. Not as a conclusion, but as a direction, a path that investigators may now be exploring more closely, guided by something that has drawn their attention to the son-in-law in a way that wasn't there before, and that raises the first question: what changed? Because attention doesn't shift without cause. It follows something, a detail, a behavior, a connection that stands out enough to be noticed. And while the specifics of that shift are still being understood, our early indications suggest that it may be tied to patterns that have been present throughout the case. Patterns that didn't fully align with the initial understanding, but were not strong enough on their own to redirect the investigation until now. Because sometimes it's not a single detail that changes everything. It's the accumulation of them. The moment where enough small inconsistencies come together to form something that can no longer be ignored. And that appears to be what is happening here. A convergence of details that, when viewed together, begin to suggest a different perspective. One that places the son-in-law within the structure of the case in a way that requires deeper analysis. And that analysis begins with behavior, because behavior is one of the most telling aspects of any investigation. It reveals how individuals respond to pressure, to uncertainty, to situations that challenge their expectations. And when those responses don't align with what is typically observed, it creates a point of interest, not as proof, but as a signal, something that prompts investigators to look closer, to ask new questions, to explore connections that may not have been fully considered before. And that's where this becomes more than just a shift in attention. It becomes a shift in perspective, a way of looking at the case that brings certain details into sharper focus. And as those details begin to align, as they start to form a pattern that can be followed, the case itself begins to change, not in its facts, but in how those facts are understood. And that's what makes this moment so significant. Because it represents the beginning of that change, The point where the investigation begins to move in a direction that feels more defined, more structured, and more capable of leading to answers. And as we move deeper into what this could mean, the timeline becomes the next point of focus, because timelines are what hold everything together. They show how events connect, how actions follow one another, and where inconsistencies may exist. And when a new perspective is introduced, especially one that shifts attention toward a specific individual, the timeline is often where the first signs of that shift become visible, because it allows investigators to place that individual within the sequence, to see how their movements, their interactions, their presence align with the events that have been established. And that alignment is what reveals whether the connection is meaningful, because if the timeline supports it, if the moments line up in a way that creates continuity, then it becomes something that can be explored further, something that can be tested against other elements of the case. And that's what appears to be happening now, a re-examination of the timeline with this new focus in mind, looking for points where the son-in-law intersects with key moments in a way that may provide insight into how the events unfolded. And as that process continues, as each moment is examined and each connection is tested, something else begins to emerge. The idea that what we are seeing is not a sudden development, but a gradual realization, a recognition of patterns that were always present but never fully understood until now. And that recognition is what drives the case forward, because it turns observation into analysis. It transforms scattered details into a sequence that can be followed and understood. And that sequence is what will ultimately lead to answers. Because once the pieces begin to connect, once the pattern becomes clear, the path forward becomes more defined, more focused, and more capable of reaching a conclusion. And that's where this case is heading now, toward that moment where everything begins to align, where the shift in attention reveals itself not as speculation, but as part of a larger structure that explains how the events of this case may have unfolded. And that structure, once fully understood, will bring with it the clarity that has been missing from the very beginning, because it will show not just what happened, but how it happened, why it happened the way it did, and what role each individual played within that sequence. And as we continue to follow this development, to examine each detail and how it connects to the next, we move closer to that understanding, closer to the moment where the story of Nancy Guthrie is no longer something we are trying to piece together, but something we can finally see in full. And that is the moment we are moving toward now, guided by this shift, this new direction that has placed the son-in-law at the center of attention in a way that demands deeper examination. And as that examination continues, as each new detail is uncovered and each connection is made, the case moves forward with a sense of purpose it hasn't had before, a sense that the answers are no longer distant, but within reach, just waiting to be fully understood. And as we move further into what is known, what is being examined, and what may be coming next, one thing becomes clear. This is not just another update. This is a turning point, and what comes next could change everything. And as that shift begins to settle into the structure of the investigation, the attention that once felt subtle starts to feel deliberate, because once a name or a role begins to circulate within the context of a case, it doesn't stay isolated, it expands. It reaches into every part of the timeline, every interaction, every decision that can now be re-examined under this new lens. And that's exactly what is happening here. Because the moment the son-in-law becomes a point of focus, even in a tentative way, everything connected to him begins to take on a different weight. On moments that once felt routine are revisited, conversations that seemed ordinary are reconsidered, and patterns that didn't fully align before are now being looked at more closely. Not as conclusions, but as possibilities that require deeper analysis. And that's where the case begins to move from observation into something more structured. Because when investigators start placing someone within the sequence of events in a new way, they don't just look forward, they look backward. They trace every step, every movement, every point of contact to understand how it fits within the larger narrative. And that process is what brings clarity, because it reveals whether the connections being considered hold together under scrutiny or fall apart when tested against the full timeline. And that's the stage we are entering now. a phase where the sequence is being reconstructed with this new perspective in mind, where each moment is being aligned with the next to see if a pattern emerges that can explain what previously felt uncertain. And as that reconstruction continues, something begins to take shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual alignment of details that start to point in the same direction. And that direction is what gives this moment its significance, because it suggests that the shift in attention is not random, it is rooted in something that has been identified, something that has drawn focus in a way that can be followed, tested, and expanded upon. And that's where behavior becomes critical, because behavior is often the first place where inconsistencies reveal themselves, not in obvious ways, but in subtle deviations from what is expected. And when those deviations appear consistently across different points in the timeline, they begin to form a pattern, and patterns are what investigators rely on because they indicate that something within the sequence is not aligning with the initial understanding, and that misalignment is what drives the case forward because it creates a need to reevaluate, to question, to look deeper into areas that may not have been fully explored before. And that's what we are seeing now. A deeper look into how the son-in-law's behavior intersects with the events of the case, not as a conclusion, but as an area of interest that requires careful analysis. And as that analysis unfolds, as each detail is examined within the context of the timeline, something else becomes clear. The importance of consistency, because consistency is what determines whether a pattern holds or breaks, whether a connection remains intact when tested against new information, and that consistency is what investigators are now measuring, comparing what is known with what is being observed to see if they align in a way that supports this shift in focus. And as that comparison continues, as each element is placed within the structure and tested against the others, the picture becomes clearer, not in a single moment, but through a series of small realizations that build upon one another until there is enough to see the outline of a sequence that makes sense. And that sequence is what will ultimately guide the investigation forward. Because once a path is identified that holds together under scrutiny, it becomes the direction that is followed, the framework within which new information is interpreted and understood. And that's what makes this moment so critical, because it represents the early formation of that framework, the beginning of a structure that may redefine how the case is viewed. And as that structure continues to develop, as each connection is strengthened and each inconsistency is explored, the focus begins to narrow, not in a way that excludes possibilities, but in a way that prioritizes them, highlighting the areas where the strongest patterns exist and directing attention toward the points where the most meaningful answers are likely to be found. And that narrowing of focus is what brings the case closer to resolution, because it allows investigators to concentrate their efforts, to test the most significant connections, and to build a narrative that is grounded in consistency rather than speculation. And that narrative, once it takes shape, becomes the foundation for everything that follows, the point from which conclusions can be drawn and actions can be taken. And that's where this is heading now, toward that moment where the sequence is no longer uncertain but defined, where the connections are no longer tentative but supported, and where the story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie begins to emerge in a way that can be clearly understood. And as we continue to follow this development, to examine each detail and how it fits within this evolving structure, we move closer to that moment. Closer to the point where everything begins to align and the answers that have been just out of reach start to come into focus. And when that happens, when the sequence holds and the narrative becomes clear, it will not just change how this case is understood, it will change how it is remembered, because it will show that the key to everything was not found in a single moment, but in the careful examination of patterns, behaviors, and connections that, when viewed together, revealed a path that was always there, waiting to be seen in the right way. And as everything begins to settle into place, as the patterns that once felt uncertain now hold steady under closer examination, the case reaches a point where the shift in attention no longer feels like a question, but a direction that continues to strengthen with each detail that aligns. Because what we are seeing is not a sudden conclusion, it is a gradual convergence, a moment where multiple elements within the case begin to point toward the same area, the same sequence, the same set of connections that, when placed together, form a structure that can be followed without breaking. And that is what changes everything. Because once a structure holds, once it remains consistent, no matter how it is tested, it becomes the foundation for understanding. Not speculation, not assumption, but a framework that allows the case to move forward with clarity. And that clarity is what has been missing from the very beginning, because without it, every detail feels isolated, every moment feels disconnected, and the story itself remains fragmented. But now with this shift in focus and the patterns that are beginning to align around it, the case starts to feel different, more cohesive, more defined, and more capable of leading to answers that make sense within the full context of what has happened. And that is the moment we are approaching now. The point where the sequence begins to reveal itself not as a collection of possibilities, but as a narrative that can be understood from beginning to end. And that narrative is what investigators are working toward, not just identifying what happened, but understanding how each moment connects to the next, how each decision influenced what followed, and how the entire sequence unfolded in a way that can be explained, examined, and ultimately confirmed. And as that narrative continues to take shape, as each connection is reinforced and each detail finds its place within the structure, something else becomes clear. The importance of perspective, because what we are seeing now is not new information appearing out of nowhere. It is existing information being viewed differently, being understood within a framework that allows it to make sense in a way it didn't before. And that shift in perspective is what has brought us to this point, because it has allowed investigators to see connections that were always there, but never fully recognized until now. And that recognition is what drives the case forward. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand how the pieces fit together, the path becomes clearer, the direction becomes more defined, and the answers begin to move from possibility into something much closer to certainty. And that is where this case is heading, toward that moment where everything aligns fully, where the sequence holds without contradiction, and where the story of Nancy Guthrie can be understood in a way that leaves no room for confusion, only for confirmation. And that confirmation is what will ultimately bring this case to its conclusion. Because once the truth is supported by a structure that remains consistent across every level of analysis, there is no longer a need to question what happened, only to acknowledge it and act on it. And that is the stage we are approaching now. The final phase where everything that has been uncovered is brought together into a complete picture. A picture that explains not just what happened, but how it happened and why it happened the way it did. And as we stand at this point, as we look at the path that has led here, it becomes clear that this case was never about a single detail, but about the way those details connect, the way they form a sequence that only now is beginning to make sense in its entirety. And that is what has brought us to this moment, this point where the shift in attention that once felt subtle has become central, where the focus that once seemed tentative has become defined, and where the case itself is moving toward a resolution that feels closer than it ever has before. And if you have followed this journey, if you have stayed with the details and the patterns as they began to align, then you already know how significant this is, because this is where everything changes. This is where the story moves from uncertainty into understanding. And this is where the truth begins to take its final shape. And if you want to see how it all comes together, how the final pieces fall into place, and what they reveal about the case as a whole, make sure you stay right here, because this is where we follow every detail to its conclusion. This is where we connect every piece until nothing is left unanswered. And this is where the truth, no matter how hidden it may seem, is brought into the light. And if there is one thing this case has shown us, it is that the smallest shift can change everything. And right now, it feels like we are witnessing that shift in real time. And what comes next may be the moment that finally reveals everything.